Hey guys, welcome to the Smart Venture Podcast. In each episode, we're going to have conversations with some of the top investors, superstar founders, as well as well-known tech company executives in Silicon Valley. We'll have a coffee chat with them to learn their way of thinking and actionable tips on how they build or invest in a successful company. Before we start our show today, I want to make sure the listener, aka you, understand that everything a person say on the podcast only reflects hers or his own opinion, not the show or the company they work at. Today, our guest is the founding partner of Polaris Partners. He is the Emeritus Chairman of the NVCA, National Venture Capital Association. He sits on the board of MIT's Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research and the Arthur Rex Center for Entrepreneurship at Harvard Business School. He was featured on the Forbes Midas List, as well as my book, How to Be a VC. His name is Thayer McGuire. This episode is the first part of the conversation with Terry, in which we'll focus on how Terry got into VC, started his fund Polaris Partners, and stay competitive while building strong relationships within the industry. Now, please enjoy. Welcome to the show, Terry.
Delighted that you asked. Thanks for inviting me on.
To start off the show, can you tell us a little bit more about how did you grow up and how did you get into venture?
Yeah, I grew up in upstate New York, and there wasn't a lot of venture capital. In fact, I've often told people I never knew what venture capital was until I was in my 20s. And of course, this was back in the 70s and 80s. And so I went to school and started looking at startup companies and got exposed to the venture capital process in that way, and thought what a cool job that would be if you can invest in a number of technologies, but probably more importantly, invest in a number of people. And so I was with a startup out of MIT called Management Technologies. They went looking for venture capital, and then that's how I got exposed to the process and sort of said I went back to business school, and from there on, I went in the venture capital world. So I've been doing this for now 30 plus years.
Yeah, just to give the audience a little bit more context, what was the venture scene like back then? I assume there weren't many startups?
Yeah, there weren't that many people doing startups. It was all hardware, actually. I was in the Boston area, and there was the legacy of the Digital Equipment Corp and some of the early computer players. And so most of the hot jobs were essentially hardware engineers that were looking to get into startups. But there weren't that many startups. It was really a handful of companies. But there was at least a legacy on the 128 sort of corridor that led people to think that there was a possibility of startup companies. And so that's what got people excited.
So since startup wasn't necessarily the most popular job back in time, can you tell us a little bit more on how did you figure out your career back in time? What was the things that you like to do, and how did you do self-development to figure out the best career for you?
Yeah, I had a sort of a blue-collar background. My dad worked in a factory. My mother had her own dancing school. And so there was a little bit of entrepreneurship within the family. And as a kid, I was always a sort of a science-oriented kid. So in schools, I enjoyed the math classes and the science classes, and just thought of the possibilities and of discovery. And so when I finally went to college, I then pursued sort of more technical. I did physics, and then I ultimately took an engineering degree and a business degree. And so I think as a kid, though, I was always just fascinated by the potential of the world and what could happen. And, at the time, it's interesting enough, we're all, of course, waiting for SpaceX to launch in the next week or so. When I was a kid, showing my age, it was really the NASA programs, the early programs, and there was just a lot of excitement about technology and the possibilities. And so I think that's partly what ignited the ideas in some of my head.
Yeah. So after business school, you started working in venture capital. What was the first company you invested in, and how did it go?
The firm that I started with in venture capital was a firm in Chicago called Goldertoll, McCressie and Rauner. And they were really transitioning from early stage investors to really later stage growth equity investors. And so, believe it or not, my very first investment was in a dairy company. There was a consolidation in a dairy, a company called Southern Foods, which was out of Dallas. And I had the great pleasure of working with Bruce Rauner, who was a partner at the time, and sort of helped Bruce with that dairy company, which ended up doing very, very well. But my first technical investment was probably when I came back to another firm called Burr, Egan, Deleage, and I did a series of healthcare investments that I did, and which also worked out pretty well. But my very first was Southern Foods, which was this dairy company.
Yeah, so since back in time, there weren't any internet, how do you get deal flows? And how do you network with other VCs, eventually do due diligence for the companies you plan to invest in?
It was, again, a very small community. There were probably only maybe a couple hundred venture capital firms at the most. And so, and oftentimes most of the deals were syndicated. So really a lot of the deal sourcing came from working with other venture capitalists. And they would find a deal that they started working on, and they were looking for someone to help them work on the deal. So that was one source. Then the second source, of course, were the entrepreneurs themselves, people who you got to know. And some of my best deals came from entrepreneurs that I had backed who sort of liked me. And so when their friends were looking for venture capital, the entrepreneur would send them my way. And so that was another source. Every once in a while you'd find a technology that was exciting in the newspaper, but usually by the time you read about it, someone else was already on top of it. So it really relied on this network of individuals was the best way to source deals.
Totally. What was the hot VC firm back then?
The hot VC firm? Kleiner Perkins has always had a wonderful reputation. They were hot. We thought we were hot.
I'm sure.
I think Wells Carson on the East Coast was always a highly regarded firm. Benrock had always, has a great reputation, had been around for quite some time. So there were some legendary, Greylock as well. So there were some legendary firms that today continue to be legendary firms. So
when a startup is doing really well, there must be a lot of VC are in the competition to invest in it. How do you position your firm to be competitive?
It's a great question. And I think at least the way I would position it, which is these are very long-term relationships. It's very rare that you invest in a company and 2 or 3 years later you sell the company. So you make an argument which is personal fit. And so there were entrepreneurs that I met that I had regard for, but I just knew I wouldn't be great partners for them. And so in that sense, I didn't pursue the deals. And those that I thought that I would be a great partner with, I would pursue hard. And I would try to get people to do the references on us and me. And so it wasn't simply about writing a check or the nature of the deal terms. It really was about the interpersonal relationships. And I think sort of stressing that was a way to win a deal. Again, if someone liked you, felt they could trust you during the troubled times, because every company will go through a period of stress, then that was a good way to win a deal. And then ultimately over time, of course, it can be a virtuous cycle. The more good deals you do, the more people that get to know you, the more they like you, the more good deals you get to do. And so if you can get on that virtuous cycle, that can be a winning strategy.
Yeah, I really like what you said about building strong relationships first. Can you walk us through an investment you've made in the past? How do you encounter the founders and how do you evaluate the deal? Do you invest in them right away?
I'm going to turn your question slightly on it, which is it's not about a specific deal, but it's about a relationship. And so I'll talk about 2 different relationships. Probably my earliest life science relationship was with Bob Langer, who's a sort of a wonderful national treasure out of MIT. And Bob has started numerous companies. In fact, we at Polaris have invested in over 25 of his companies. And so the very first relationship was I got a call from a friend who was starting a company with Bob. And I got to meet Bob and realize that he was a unique academic. He was a unique entrepreneur because he was so prolific in starting companies. And I remember the conversation, which is many venture capitalists, when they would meet with Bob, would try to sort of say, hey, Bob, why don't you put all your technology into one company? And Bob would sort of say, I'm generating new technology every day, and so it doesn't make sense to put them all in one company. And I remember sitting with Bob and sort of saying, I'd love to work with you and do a lot in the future together. And he said, well, that's great. He said, but I'm not going to put it all in one company. I said, that's not a problem, but just show me every company that you do. And so he said, well, that's easy enough to do, and I'd love to do that. And so I've now been working with Bob for the last 2 decades, almost 3 decades in companies, and there's a number of Langer successful companies. But I think it's really sort of, and so what happens now is Bob will call and sort of say, I've got another startup that's coming out of my lab or someone I work with, and he'll call us and we'll quickly say yes, because we love saying yes to Bob and investing in his companies. Second relationship is the one that I have with Tillman Gerngross up at Dartmouth, and it's a somewhat similar story. Tillman was starting a company in the protein space and called Glycofy. And I got a call from a good friend who was starting with him, and Charles Hutchinson. And Hutch had called and said, "Here's a unique character, which is Tillman Gerngross. He's a force of nature." And so we invested in Glycofy. It turned out to be a pretty rapid success. And then Tillman has now started 6 or 7 other companies. And so we've, again, had the same relationship with Tillman as I do with Bob, which is when he calls, the answer is yes. And then the next question is, what are you doing? So it's really, for me at least, it's not about any one company or it's really about these relationships that are maintained, again, over multiple years, if not decades.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to invest in relationships with people. And because of the relationships, you get quality deals from it. So when you pick these friends and business partners, what quality did you see in them? What characteristic did you identify early on that demonstrate these people could go on to create successful businesses? Do you invest in every company they try to create, or just the one that fits your thesis?
Yeah. Well, let me answer the second question, then I'll have you restate the first question to make sure I answer it right, which is the qualities that we look for are and I'll go back to this marriage analogy, which is we're looking for people that we know we can trust, that are basically where we can align our interests as best as we can, and where the goal is, we have a similar goal. In the case of Bob and in the case of Tillman, the goal really is to change the world, to make the world a better place and have a human impact. And so, we're looking for people that have that same goal in mind. It isn't simply about a financial transaction or building, just simply building a company. It's about building a company which has meaning. I think some of the entrepreneurs that we backed, Tillman, Bob, Paul Schimmel, Bill Sharp, Kari Stephenson, they're all unique. They're brilliant. They're highly motivated. They have a unique and an innate business sense, which is many academics don't. And most of the people we back are academics, but these individuals have this unique ability to understand business. And I've often said that, the best entrepreneurs are 95% normal, and then there's something, the 5% extraordinary about them. And each is different. I mean, what's extraordinary about Bob is he's so collaborative and brilliant and creative. And what's unique about Tillman is that he's very decisive and very energetic about getting to a goal. I mean, you can sort of identify each character in some way, and sort of identifying that 5% difference, that's what makes them extraordinary, makes all the difference. But they're all unique, so not one of them copies the other. They all have different styles. But finding those styles has really been the most important thing. So those are the characteristics that we've done for people. We've not done every single deal with Bob as an example. And there's some deals where Bob, we simply wait for Bob to show us deals. Some things he's working on that he doesn't think is right for prime time. Others that he's been invited to and that already had venture capital funding. So I can't say that I've done every Langer deal or every Tillman deal, but my goal in life is to do as many as they will show me.
Totally. Speaking of building great relationships, you built your own fund with co-founders. Can you tell us a little bit more about how did you start your fund and how did you create your own team? At what point of your career did you decide to do so?
Yeah. We, and you and I chatted about this in the past, but, I came from a legacy firm, a firm called Burr, Egan, Deleage. And at one point, Burr, Egan, Bill Egan, Craig Burr, and Jean Deleage came to the partner and said, what do we want to do? And we concluded that we wanted to evolve into 3 different firms. And so there was sort of this natural selection of partners. Myself and John Flint and Steve Arnold were the 3 founders of Polaris. We decided we wanted to go off and start our own firm. And the other partners went into 2 different firms themselves. So I think in that sense, it was a natural process. We had a track record. We had worked together. We had looked at deals together. It was a very comfortable, almost fraternal relationship that we were close as brothers. And we felt that we would be good in both good and bad times. Again, most firms, as you know, go through good periods and bad periods. So it's really knowing that people are going to be well-behaved and aligned during the bad periods is the most important thing. And so, we were good partners and we saw things alike. And so when John and Steve and I started Polaris, we had a track record. We could go to limited partners, some of which were the Burr, Egan, Deleage limited partners, and say, this is what the deals that we've done. And at the time, and even today, I think limited partners are interested in sort of new funds. And there was a line that we used that I like, which is, new funds are high on the learning curve, but they're also high on the yearning curve, that they really are very eager to be successful. And so limited partners like that phenomenon of knowing that there's a lot of experience with the firm, but also that there's a team that has something to prove. And so that's what enabled us to, when we had this partnership that worked out well. But we also had limited partners that wanted to back us, and so that allowed us to raise our first fund fairly easily.
Yeah, it's really great that you and your team already had worked together in the past. Raising funding for the fund is extremely hard, especially first-time fund. There were no doubt that you and your team accomplished some really great returns back in time. How many deals have you invested in before you started to raise your own fund? And what was the conversation like with the LPs?
Yeah, so without getting into all the details of our track record, when we went out to raise Polaris, we had cash-on-cash returns that were substantially in the upper decile of returns, and there were multiple companies. It wasn't one single company which generated all the returns, and so a limited partner could look at 20. I'm guessing this now, but we probably had 20 companies between the two of us that we had invested in. And so a limited partner could go back and look and see the profile of the companies that we've invested in. And again, I think that helped with the process. And
healthcare is one of the area needs a lot of expertise, and it takes many years to see the results. How do you came up with the strategy for investing in healthcare?
I think, again, starting investing in sort of the late 80s, early 90s, that's when the biotechnology revolution was really taking shape. You had some early companies like Genentech and Genetics Institute here in Boston, and ultimately Biogen here in Boston that were doing well. And so I think it was the new frontier. And so in that sense, you knew it was going to be an exciting place, and it continues to be an exciting place. So that part of the thesis was right. As you know from my background, I don't have a life science background. I'm more of an engineer, and so I quickly realized that I didn't have the technical expertise to do the evaluation. But I'll go back to my people analogy before, which is if I knew the right people to ask the right questions, I could get good answers. And so that was the other importance of the network. And so, we quickly sort of said it was an important space to be in, that there was going to be a lot of lives that were going to be touched positively, probably good economics that would be attached to doing our jobs right. And then we just pursued it. And so, and like everything else, the more you do, the more you see, the more you see, the more you do. And so we've developed this broad network of successful entrepreneurs and researchers that we've worked with in the past, so we continue to rely on that network. The other thing which we did as the firm grew is we hired in people or brought in partners who had experiences that we didn't have. So, for example, one of the managing partners, Emeritus, has a PhD in chemical engineering out of MIT. Brian Chi has an MBA, but also had worked at Baxter and a healthcare company. So we sort of recruited in people that were part of the organization who had skills that we didn't have, and so that complemented what we were doing. But the thesis all along was that healthcare was going to be important, and it, 20 years later, it still proves to be very important.
Since a lot of healthcare company may be based on new scientific discovery, which takes a long time, what are some early indicators to see if it will have good financial outcome?
Yeah, it's an important question. And the thing that's been striking to me, having been in the business now for 20 years, is that sometimes the least obvious companies turn out to be the most successful companies. There are clearly trends that you're pursuing. For example, in the gene editing space, the whole CRISPR-Cas9 space, and we were an early investor in a company called Editas. And so you could see everything shifting to that was going to be important science. But then there are other companies, and I'll use Glycophi as an example, which is when we invested in Glycophi, which was doing glycosylating proteins using yeast. When I did my diligence, everyone sort of said, "Don't bother. Too many people have tried that before. It's not going to work. You're going to end up losing all your money on it." And we sort of said, "Well, but if it does work, if we can crack the code, we'll make a difference." And the answer was yes, but no one's ever cracked the code, so don't bother. And so that was a situation where we actually went sort of against the grain and turned out to be a fantastic investment. So I think you have to go back to the fundamentals, which is if the technology can yield, will it have a true impact? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably something that's worth pursuing. But then I want to complement it again with it's the people. You know, if it were just any, when we did Glycofy with Tillman, it wasn't just any person that was involved. When we did Editas, it was with George Church and some others and others there. So it really goes back to the people.
That's all we have for today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Smart Venture Podcast. In the next episode, we'll focus on actions Terry took to build strong relationships, his management philosophy, and strategies for his fund. Don't forget to come back on Wednesday for the second part of the conversation with Terry. If you like it, please leave us a quick review and hit subscribe so you don't miss any tips from the experts. If you want to receive our updates, please leave your email at smartventurepod.com. If you want to connect with me, all my socials are at GraceGownGG. Besides LinkedIn, it's just Grace Gown. I'd love to connect with you and let me know your thoughts about the show. See you next time.